now we're going to start our panel discussion and audience Q&A session. So I guess if anyone has questions, we can start with those questions, and we'll have a mic running around from the back.
This is both for Harish and Jim. There are some conversations that V2V is not going to fly because of the latency issues. Do you see the same thing, or is it going to be V2I2V is going to be the best approach for AV and the mobility to succeed?
It's a very good question, and certainly some smarter folks in the room here that can give you the detailed answer. But my take of it is it's going to be a combination of solutions. There's no winner takes all sort of approach to V2V or V2I. It's utilizing everything that's out there, especially when there's been no standards or no high-level plan approach to these various solutions and products and services.
So, well, I don't have a definite answer to you because it's difficult to predict what's going to happen with technology in the future. But it's very likely that, from a technology perspective, we're going to have a reliable solution. And even for now, for example, if 5 years ago, we used, if you asked me what's the technology for V2V, I would have said DSRC. Right, but now recently with the FCC rule, it looks like DSRC is not going to have like a very bright future. It's going to be 5G, right? And we don't know how long 5G is going to be. Right? So from the technology perspective, it's safe to assume in the future it's going to be possible to have very reliable communication, but there are more important aspects to consider. So, for example, if you're thinking about V2V, there's a huge issue of cybersecurity. Right. So if you're just trying to communicate, send all your data and receive data from neighboring vehicles, do you have to first trust those vehicles? In fact, like 1 year ago, there was a news article where there was hackers trying to fool Tesla autonomous lane changing, and they fooled it and caused an accident. So V2V has more of a security issues rather than technology and efficacy issues. So that's how I would say.
I think so. Yeah, coming from a separate industry, coming from the cloud computing industry prior to this, I think it's an interesting question to talk about whether or not V2V is less reliable because of latency concerns when you're talking about adding another hop into V2I2V deployment, right? So there's the security aspect of having to trust each of the individual devices on the vehicle, which is valid. But now if you go to a V2I2V model, now we have to trust a centralized distribution network and supervisor over the passing of those messages. So, I personally, and I don't have any data to back this up, have a hard time injecting a secondary source of infrastructure and suddenly now saying that we have another point of failure, potentially a single point of failure, and having that now be a more reliable solution. So I think seeing what happens with DSRC, whether or not the NPRM comes down on one side of that or the other the next 60 days, whether or not Qualcomm is successful with C-V2X, I think there's a lot of questions there, but specifically with injecting centralized infrastructure from a theoretical or philosophical perspective, personally don't necessarily see that being a compelling argument.
So actually, in some ways, I do agree with you too. So if you think about blockchain, right, and if let's say blockchain technologies are very very well popular and well used in the future, people are going to start going away from a single point of security to blockchain security. So in which case, maybe V2V would be dominant. It's difficult to predict. But from my experience, technology issues like latency issues, they are not going to be the bottleneck because, if they're latency now, 2 years from now, it's not going to be. So we always want to look at other issues when it comes to this.
As a follow-up to that question, we know we need low latency for vehicle-to-vehicle infrastructure, and for many years we didn't have even the concept of 5G, and we knew that we needed a piece of infrastructure that might be $10,000 or $20,000 every 100 meters, or at least in areas that are built up. Where are we in the maturation rate of 5G supporting these V2I, V2V applications? And in particular, I believe the US DOT had a unfunded mandate of 20 connected vehicle enabled intersections per state to be implemented in 2020? Are we anywhere near doing that?
So I can comment on that,
Anybody
Jim.
can take it.
I just wanted to share a couple of things. So that SPAT challenge that you're talking about, the signal phase and timing, the 20 intersections in every state by 2020. Florida DOT has a couple of those underway. So up in Tallahassee and in Gainesville, they're working on that. I don't know about what 5G is gonna do. I don't know, but I hear a lot of promises. I did want to share one thing that we're doing in Gainesville. Our company provides hardware, a video camera that looks at the stop bar to manage the intersection. We also detect pedestrians that are going across the crosswalk and bicycles that are in the vehicle lanes, and we detect them and count them as well as the vehicles. But what we're doing in Gainesville, we're doing a pilot to see if our hardware detects a pedestrian or a bicycle, can we tell the vehicle via Bluetooth beacon? So something that's a lot cheaper than your $10,000 an intersection. So we'll have some results on that, later this year to further muddy the water as to which way to go. DSRC, 5G, Bluetooth, maybe.
Well, Pete, when I say $10,000 per intersection, I mean, I could see on an OEM basis in a vehicle that 802.11p box might not be so different than the router in my house. Huge volumes, low cost, not a big deal. I know I talked to Qualcomm years ago, and they said, don't worry. Those radios and that chipset's ready to go, and you can have Vida in your phone. But somehow, with the low volume and the environmental issues of putting a stainless steel box on a 12-foot pole, that just seems to me to be a real heavy lift for, public agencies. And maybe we just have to wait until the telecom providers come up with, a legitimate 5G solution.
So I was at the SAE government industry meeting, I think it's 2 weeks ago at this point, and there's a gentleman who runs the industry or the division you're referencing from Georgia Department of Transportation. So specifically looking at all the SPAT-enabled intersections throughout Atlanta and the broader Atlanta metro area. And the actual cost for the DSRC-based solutions is a lot lower than you think it is. I think he was referencing something around $1,500 to $2,000 per intersection to have a roadside unit or a modification of the roadside unit made, including labor and installation for essentially the implementation of DSRC. I think the challenge we're going to see now is, who can tell me what 5G actually is? It's not a product, it's an idea, and it's a concept, right?
No, we got one.
Yeah, it's a new standard, but if I want to go buy a 5G technology, and I've had this Verizon with a few telecom providers because they'll start talking about edge computing and here's what we're doing in the edge space and we're going to provide capabilities. I can't go buy it today as a product. It's got very specific technology applications and use cases. So as we get to what's the 5G going to mean for V2V and V2I, I think it's unclear. There are solutions what Qualcomm's putting forward again, C-V2X and various use cases, but I think relying on, again, my personal opinion, telecoms to suddenly have a broad solution that's going to solve the transportation industry challenges, I think is probably a little optimistic. That, we've got low-cost solutions today that can probably be used to make a lot more progress, but we're going to have to see how that plays out with the regulatory environment.
Yeah, by Pete Murray, I produced the Connected Cities tour, and last year we were in New York, we were in Columbus, Ohio. What's the third? Oh, Tampa. We're in Tampa. Bob. But in any case, 5G is a couple of 3-4 years away from being even remotely capable of doing, realizing any of this promise. The bigger issue right now is I take it you're using DSRC with what the FCC is doing and trying to rip that spectrum and throw it back into the mass pile is insane when you look at where cellular is, because that's not here yet. So there is this big issue. I mean, how does it affect you if the FCC makes this ruling and DSRC suddenly isn't under your control?
Yeah, so I think, we work with a shuttle manufacturer that has implemented onboard units for DSRC to essentially enable SPAT, right? So we talked a lot about signal phase and timing and the importance of that for safety applications and AVs, right? Typically, because we don't have the human on board to judge speak that unspoken language essentially about scanning a horizon for a red light, so we want to be able to, when an AV comes to an intersection, increase red light time essentially to make sure we can clear an intersection. When we don't have the ability to do that, and we're waiting on a technology that's potentially 5 to 10 years in the future before being realizable, not just on board the vehicles, because there's, again, one sole source provider for that chip right now. It happens to be Qualcomm, and they have a really good partnership with Ford. But without having that capability, it's a huge step back in terms of our ability to drive those safety use cases with existing technology today. Now, the FCC hasn't come out and explicitly said there won't be a carve out for DSRC. I think that's part of the public comment period. So if you have an opinion, please comment on that. Let's participate in democracy. But I tend to agree with you that 5G is out there. And if you listen to anyone in the industry, especially the AV industry, they'll tell you that it's a 3 to 5 year setback in terms of our ability to leverage any of these use cases in real world applications.
Besides testing, you can't string, they've got to get a whole massive area covered.
Yeah, and it's expensive.
And that was my point. FDOT is responsible for 8,000 some intersections. And how many of those are rural areas, right? Where you're not going to have these connectivity issues.
Well, and 5G is all based around, essentially an extension of fiber backhaul networks into localized areas. And I don't think Verizon or AT&T is going to be putting backhoes out in rural Florida to drive fiber lines, right?
So just an extension to that. So there is there is this thing called software-defined radio, and I think in the future of ITS, the SDR will play a heavy role. So if you ask maybe 25 years ago in the academic walls, people used to say, okay, in 15 more years, SDR will be everywhere, right? So the advantage of having SDR is, let's say if you go from DSRC to 5G, you just do a software update instead of changing the whole technology. So that's the advantage of software-defined radio instead of hardware-defined. But the problem is it's still very expensive. And 25 years ago, people said, okay, 15 years from now, it will be cheap, but it's still very expensive. And that's why it's not being used. So in the future of ITS, there may be SDRs. Once we have very low cost analog to digital converters and digital to analog converters, then that may change, and we probably don't need to worry about which particular technology you're using because you just make a software update. So.
Thank you for the provocative question.
So now we've touched on blockchain, 5G, mobility as a service. We're hitting all the buzzwords today. So we are coming close to the end of the session. So I did want to I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the human factors here. So we have all the tech, but we also have the other side. So maybe we can talk about some of the cultural issues in moving towards mobility as a service, on demand, and away from the private car. There's a concept out there from MIT called car pride. In a lot of cultures, folks who pull up in their private vehicle are sort of on a higher level of status, people who ride the bus, for example, right? And you can measure that, and we can talk about that. So, Pete, maybe you can give your perspective for Mas.
Yeah, I think that's a valid thing for sure. We love the freedom and independence, and I was in New Jersey when I grew up, and when I turned 17, which is when I could get my license, I was there on my birthday. Now, people nowadays may not be there trying to get their driver's license. It may not be an issue for them. So I think there's certainly some of that there. We don't want to give up that freedom and independence, but we don't know the cost of it. And it's the cost to us and to society. So that's why we have to talk about that bigger picture benefits to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And there could always be this, it's not an overnight transition to mobility service and all that. I mean, part of it is just moving from 2-car families to 1-car families and using that to subsidize your mobility as a service subscription or on-demand service.
That'd be terrific.
Mm-hmm. So
We could do that.
there's that as well. Clayton, I'm curious, what has been the public response for folks in Lake Nona who've been using your autonomous vehicles?
So I think that it depends on who you ask, right? I think, there was definitely at the very beginning kind of a novelty factor, and everybody wanted to ride it because, it was the new thing. It was exciting. You don't really get to do that kind of thing very often. And you're always going to have that group of people that want to be part of the new thing. There's that fear of missing out angle, right? So they're going to get on the new thing. They're going to buy the new iPhone. Anytime they're going to trade in their car every year. And we had a large group of people at the very beginning that just wanted to try. What we've noticed over time, though, is that it started to get a better reputation of actually being fun. Like, so people started enjoying it. We started to get those people that probably wouldn't have done something like that before, but we're now dipping their toes in that water, right? So it's like, you know, at risk of making a provocative statement, you know, it's people like my parents who aren't going to hop on an autonomous vehicle because they just frankly don't trust it, or my dear wife, who I love dearly, but would never ride the thing unless I was with her to guarantee that it was safe, right? So we're starting to see more of those people become more comfortable with the idea of autonomy. Where we're still trying to make inroads is the other drivers in the community, right? People aren't used to interacting with autonomous vehicles on the roadway. And we talked about kind of how do you signal to other drivers and how do you kind of start to handle that interaction. We have displays on both sides, the front and the back, that tell other drivers exactly what the vehicle's doing. Slowing down, stopping, turning left, turning right. We still get a lot of feedback through FDOT and through other means on what can be made to improve that experience for other road users, such that they feel comfortable with those shuttles on the roadway. They know how to interact with them, and they can know what to expect moving forward. But in general, you know, very quick uptake at the beginning, and now that it's becoming kind of more ingrained in that community, seeing a lot more engagement. We have people saying, "Oh, you're with Beep, so what's going on here?" Like people asking a lot of questions about the service, where we're expanding, what it's like to operate. They'll notice new cameras being put up around Lake Nona Town Center, and they go, "Oh, are you guys using that camera for your shuttle stuff?" So there's kind of an interesting embracing of the technology in terms of it becoming a regular part of the community.
And one day it'll be just boring, right?
You know, if it's boring, that means we've done something really right because things are going very well.
Absolutely. You don't notice when things go great.
So my name's Ron Manson. I work with Tavistock. We're the developer of Lake Nona, and
Oh, perfect.
and I live on Tavistock Lakes Boulevard, so I watch the shuttles go past my house every day.
Yeah.
And at first, the shuttles are going slow, so people were very frustrated with the speed. And you went to measures to ease that pain by pulling over halfway down the street, so people are maybe losing a minute and a half during that 1.2 mile run.
Yeah.
I think our bigger challenge is people from outside of the community that get frustrated, and those are the ones that tend to want to pass, and
Yeah.
they're the ones that are frustrated. But the community has fully embraced it, and you know they're proud of Beep. So glad to have them there, and it's been a real hit.
Wow, incredible.
Let me just add, I went up to the Villages, the retirement community here, and they had Voyage there, which they just pulled back and went back to California and shut that down. But I rode on the vehicle, and it wasn't completely autonomous. Drivers still had control. And it was like people literally were pointing at it, and it was a huge item with the retired community, and they really saw an application. But retrofitting the vehicles way more challenging than creating the shuttle.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the huge issues even with US-made vehicles if you're in a multi-passenger mode is that you have to provide for ADA compliance. So if you tack on, you know, wheelchair ramps, the AI is not a good word, but the automation to essentially enable a safely loading a wheelchair-bound user, for example, safely into a vehicle and securing them, the process around that. There's some weird cost dynamics involved with that as well, right? You're increasing the weight of an electric vehicle.
Sure.
EVs don't like to be heavy. So a lot of interesting considerations of how we actually untap that kind of marketplace in the U.S.
And
Wow.
then you have the visually impaired and the hearing
Absolutely.
impaired, right? A lot of
Yeah. We
things
don't
to
want
think
this technology and this movement to be just for the Tesla Model S crowd. You know what I mean? Well, that's great. And I think we could keep talking all morning. But unfortunately, it is 10 o'clock. It is the end of the session. So let's give a round of applause to our speakers.